So, transport, getting across the cell membrane. The whole point is to keep what's outside outside and inside inside and only let the right things across. This is a part of maintaining homeostasis. The idea that the cell wants to have a stable internal environment that helps it to live and keep that from being affected too much by the environment outside the cell, so that it controls things like temperature and pH and other variables. Well, in terms of getting across the cell barrier, across the cell membrane, really one of the key ways to get across is through something called passive transport. Passive transport, it's passive. It uses no energy. That's what it means. It's passive, doesn't use any energy. And it's based on the concept of diffusion. We've talked about diffusion before. Diffusion is the natural tendency of anything, any solute of any kind, to go from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. That if you spray perfume in the corner of the room, then that perfume has a high concentration. The molecules of the perfume have a high concentration in that corner. Over time, they will naturally drift apart until they fill the entire room at spaces equally distant from each other. Will naturally travel from the part of the room where there's a high concentration to the parts of the room where there's a low concentration of perfume molecules. That's what diffusion is, that any solute wants to equalize its distribution so it has the same percentage on both sides of the barrier, in this case, the barrier of the cell membrane. So, for instance, things like oxygen, carbon dioxide will pass across the cell membrane. And what they're doing is they're essentially balancing so that if there's a high amount of oxygen outside the cell and a low amount inside, well, it's going to go from the high concentration to the low concentration and therefore enter into the cell. If carbon dioxide's in a high concentration inside the cell and in a low concentration outside the cell, the carbon dioxide is going to leave the cell and go outside because it naturally travels from high concentration to low concentration. And it'll do that, many things will even do that through the barrier of the phospholipid bilayer. But sometimes what happens is that the cell membrane has a protein in it called a carrier protein. And these proteins, what they do is they have facilitated diffusion. Now, there's diffusion in the name, so it's still diffusion. It's still passive transport. It doesn't use any energy. But instead of something having to go through the phospholipid bilayer, now this carrier protein provides basically a little hole, a little spot that is hospitable to that particular kind of molecule so that it come into and out of the cell more easily instead of having to pass through the hydrophobic heads on the inside of the cell, through the hydrophilic space in the middle of the cell membrane, past the hydrophobic heads on the outside of the cell membrane into the intercellular space, or the other way. Instead, they go through a carrier protein that allows those molecules to more easily equalize themselves inside and outside of the cell. This is an example of osmosis. Osmosis is just water diffusing across a selectively permeable membrane. That's what it is. Osmosis is that balancing of water across a membrane, just like balancing a solute across a membrane. It's trying to get to an equal concentration. Specifically, those parts of the cell membrane that are involved in the transport of water are called aquaporins. So an easy way to remember this is you start with aqua for water, and then you think about a big picture of it pouring the water into the cell. That's an aquaporin. That is the kind of channel protein that gives water the ability to perform facilitated diffusion. Remember, facilitated diffusion is still diffusion. There's still no energy. It's still just making the concentration equal, but it's making it happen a little bit more quickly, a little bit more easily. So far, we've talked about things that don't require any energy. Next time, we're going to talk about how you transport things using energy.